Hello, my name is Sue and I'm going to show you a few things that you can do when you come to paint leaves. We tend to think of leaves as all green, but I've actually picked a few from around my garden, and as you can see there's a huge variety of shapes, of edge patterns and of colours on the leaves, even when it's not autumn. This dock leaf this morning that I found has got the most extraordinary colours and blemishes on, which will be fun. And here's a cyclamen leaf with some very interesting patterning on it, an ivy leaf which really isn't green, and of course the primrose leaves are very interesting because they have these little puffy pillows all over and a very crinkly edge. And then we have here a geranium leaf with patterning on it, quite remarkable veins and this serrated edge which could be interesting to paint. And I just want to show you a couple of non-botanical but fun techniques, but I'd need to just draw a few leaves and then we'll get on with the painting. Now first of all, you don't need to be terribly afraid of drawing these leaves. They've got some complicated shapes on some of them, but really if you lay them down on a piece of paper you can actually just draw around the edge. I want to start off with this leaf here, which you may be able to see has lots and lots of veins that just radiate from this anchor point here. It's the leaf of the ginkgo biloba tree, which is a very ancient species of tree. And I love doing all these little veins, and I'm going to show you how you can do them without actually painting them. And I've got out some paint here. I've got a yellow, a red, and a blue, and that's a sort of brownish red, and those are the only colours I'm going to use here. So starting off, I'm going to wet the leaf and then I'm going to drop the paint into that wet surface, and then I'm going to show you a couple of methods for getting those veins added in without actually having to paint them in with a teeny little brush. Okay, so that is wet. Now I can paint this any colour I like, because in summer they are bright green, then they go a beautiful yellow, and then they go brown. So I think I'm going to make this one a slightly brownish green. And I always mix my green from a yellow and a blue. And then if it's too sharp a green, just a little touch of red to tone it down. Right, let us apply that. And the consistency of this is reasonably thick. It's sort of like full cream milk. Okay. And largely the water is carrying the paint around, so I don't need to stir it around too much. It travels in, the pigment travels in the water. Okay, and then you can see, because it's flat, it hasn't had a chance to move, but if I tilt the board it'll flow together more. But the paint that I'm using is fairly thick, so it may need just a little bit of a nudge. Okay, and I'm just doing that in the direction that those veins flow. And then there comes my stalk. Right, so there we have a ginkgo biloba leaf. Just tidying up those edge shapes a little. Now if I were to paint in those veins, I'd need to leave this to dry, but I don't want to be doing that. So I'm going to pick up a watercolour pencil and just draw some lines in. Now I'm not really interested in the colour of the pencil or the marks that it is making. It's more about the lines that are being dug through the paint. So just radiating from that centre point. And what happens here is that the paint settles in to the incisions made by dragging something sharp through. Just got a little dry patch there. There we go. And as this dries, those lines will become more intense. Now, to show you that it's not the green of the pencil that's making those lines, I'm going to do a similar thing, but I'm going to use a tool that doesn't have any colour on the way the watercolour pencil has. So here I'm wetting the leaf in exactly the same way, and then I'm going to put paint in it. So again, blue, add yellow, and I have green. And it needs to be reasonably thick because the water's already there. And I'm not driving the paint backwards and forwards across the leaf. I'm letting it spread in the water. Okay, so the paint is on, and now we need to paint those veins, but not with paint. I'm going to use a sharp tool. Now, how sharp it is depends on how careful you are and possibly your age. For a younger person, I would recommend using something like a little wooden coffee stirrer. And you see, I'm just drawing with that. And I'm going to end up with the same effect as using a coloured pencil. Now, for somebody who's able to be a little more careful or a little safer, you might want to use something with a finer tip. And I've got here a needle, and I actually keep one permanently embedded in this cork that I can use like a handle, and I can get very fine lines. And then as soon as these two leaves have dried, we'll be able to see the difference. I just went off the edge there, I just need to tidy that. And there we go, we're going to let that dry for a couple of minutes. The next leaf I want to look at while this is still drying is this gorgeous leaf full of bumps and crinkles and textures and blemishes. And I'm going to show you a fun technique for getting that sort of irregular patterning on there. So again, I'm going to start by wetting the leaf. Now, because it has a vein up the center that I don't want to cover, I'm actually going to paint it in two halves. So wet one side up to the central vein, and you see the difference. That's got radiating veins. This has got one main vein down the center. And in this case, I'm not going to be that interested in all the other small veins that come off that central vein. This one's more about the textures and patterns that we can see on the leaf surface and the crinkly shapes around the edges. So again, painting with water to begin with, so that the paint will just flow all over the leaf and the colours will blend. Right, not too wet, so I can just wipe a little off if there's too much water. The kind of paper you use will also determine how long you have to work with, because some papers actually absorb the water rather quickly. Watercolour paper is treated so that it won't absorb it far too quickly. Now, let's have a look at the colour. I think we want to start with something yellowish and add some of that browny red into it. Perhaps more of the browny red. I'm not trying to recreate the colours that I'm seeing in front of me, just getting an approximation. Okay, putting in this lovely reddish colour, reasonably thickly. And you see where the water has gone is where the paint will flow, and where the where the paper is dry, the paint doesn't actually reach there. And that's the reason, one of the reasons as well for painting water on first, that you can then see and control where the paint is going to go. I think I want to add a little bit of green up here. And I've got to go reasonably quickly because I want to get the whole leaf covered before anything dries off. Okay, and you see with watercolour all these colours just blend together because the water carries the pigment. So I do a little bit of mixing on the palette. Just putting together a selection of interesting colours, and every now and then I'm just going to put one of these spotty patches and they'll blend out softly. Right. That's just about done. Get some of these lovely little red crinkles around the edges. And then I'm going to get some effects happening here. What I'm going to add is a little bit of ordinary table salt sprinkled in. Season lightly. And then we need to leave this for a little while and you'll see what happens. It's going to take a little while for this to develop, so I'm going to continue with this ivy leaf, which you can see has a central vein and one leading to each point down here, and they are raised and quite prominent, but I'm actually not going to go around them the way I did with that one, nor am I going to incise them. I'll show you another trick for this one, but again I'm going to wet the leaf and drop the paint in. Now here we have two colours largely. It's sort of green in this area and it moves out towards a golden area, and then there's a bit of brown at the end. So wetting it, and I'm just going to let the paint flow together in this wet surface. Right, so I've got that wet, keep my reference there, and going back to the blue and the yellow, needs more yellow, and a bit more water to get closer to that colour. With watercolour we don't use white paint, we just add more water to lighten the colour. And painting into water, it is going to dry lighter than what is applied anyway because the water on the surface dilutes it. Now I think I may have been talking for too long there, and this has dried a little, so I'm just going to re-wet. Just give the paint somewhere to flow. That's better. And then moving towards a more golden colour in the lower part of the leaf. And I think I need to add more green in the central part now. So I'm just dotting it in because the water will disperse the pigment. And then towards this lower end, I'm going to add in some brown. Now obviously I don't have brown paint here, but if I take the blue and the yellow and the browny red and mix them all together, I'll get brown. So let's just add some in along here. And then there are all these little blemishes. So while it's still damp, I'm just going to dot some in here and there with fairly thick paint, because there's already quite a bit of water on. And if I put it in too watery, it'll just blend together. So let's add some nice thick dark paint and just make some spots. If it's watery, they'll just smush all over. But here they should hold their shape just a little. Of course, if it's too thick, it won't spread around. Okay, and I'm going to give that one a little stalk by just drawing some of the paint out with the brush. So I didn't actually pick up any paint, it's just come straight from that leaf and drawn it up. Now this is starting to develop some texture, but it needs longer, and that needs to dry before I can show you what happens next. So I want to move now to this primrose leaf, which is a very crinkly, crackly kind of thing. And again, I'm going to wet the leaf. If you paint just with the paint onto dry paper, you'll find it's much more difficult to get it to blend. Going into a wet surface is much, much easier. Okay. Now I'm going to use quite thick paint for this. So, yellow, with a little bit of the green in, down at this end, which is paler, more of a sort of limey colour. And again, I don't want the colour too pale because of the texture I want to show you. Okay, now we need to darken it, so much more blue in the mix. Okay. And again, I'm letting the water do most of the work, carrying the pigment across the leaf. Do you see how I'm just letting the outside shape become crinkly? Just exaggerate that a little bit down here. And now I need to leave this to be semi-dry, so it's no longer as shiny as this. So it takes a bit of patience. If I wait too long and it becomes completely dry, my technique won't work. Now this one is nearly dry, and there are parts of it which are shiny and parts which have started to lose the sheen. So I can either use a dropper, or for me, I think more precisely the tip of a brush, and I'm just going to make little dots of water, particularly where it's nearly dry. And where it's wet, I'll need to wait a few moments longer. But what's going to happen is the pigment is going to be disturbed by these little drops of water, and I'm going to get a mottled sort of pattern. And now is the time when we can start to look at this and see the interesting textures that are developing where the salt has repelled the pigment, and you get these little white sort of starburst effects. And I'm going to leave it a little while longer to develop in a more interesting fashion. Here the paint has dried and I'm sitting with these little damp bits where the salt has some water trapped underneath it. So if I blot that and lift it, you can see I get lovely little speckled patterns. And I'm going to leave that a little bit longer for that to develop. And that needs to dry before I show you how I'm going to do the veins there. Here's one where I'm going to show you another technique for applying the veins. And again, this is a beautiful golden to brown leaf. So let's get that wet. And of course, while I'm doing that, I'm keeping an eye on this one and I'm keeping an eye on that one so that I don't miss my moment. All right, so that one is wet. And then we look at the colour and we go mostly yellow. Maybe a little bit more red into it till we get a sort of golden colour. Yes, that's a sort of lovely caramel gold colour. And again, I'm just touching it in, letting it spread by itself. And in fact, that's why I love to paint in watercolour, because watching the paint just spread all by itself in water is a very relaxing and mindful exercise. Right, and now we start making the colour go a little bit more brown by adding this reddish brown and a little bit of blue to darken it. You see, you really only need 3 colours, and I very seldom use green paint. I mix it up from blue and yellow, and then sometimes add a little bit of red if it's too harsh a green. But very often the greens that you buy in a paint tube or in a paint pan are actually very unnatural looking. It's far better to mix them up yourself. Okay, now that's quite watery, so it's likely that it's going to dry paler. So I'm just actually wiping off a little of the water, and then I'll add in a little more paint. Otherwise it'll be way too pale. So now I'll add in some more paint with a smaller brush, which will carry less of the water. So let's mix up some more yellow. And the colour I'm using here is called Brown Madder. It's not actually brown, it's a sort of reddish brown. So I've thickened it up because there's already quite a lot of water on the paper. And now let's start to get that to look richer. And here we start to see it coming out between the veins. So I will just have a few brush strokes doing that, but letting the yellow golden colour show through. See, again, not too much dragging of the paint over the paper. You've got to get away from the sense of painting a wall. Okay, and that needs to dry off a little. Okay, now I need to come back to my primrose leaf and see what's happening to it. drop in a few more little water drops. And again, let's have a look at this one. See if I can blot off a little more. Yes, getting some beautiful effects. Now I can just leave it to dry naturally, but I get impatient and I want to see what's going on. And in fact, what I might do here is just add in a couple more blotches. And it's still quite wet, so they'll spread a little. Okay. Now, what do we have with this leaf? It's a green one with a central vein and some brown. We haven't done. All right, let's get on with that one. Bigger brush to wet it. Again, coming around the central vein. And let's have plenty of green paint on one side. So that's just the blue and the yellow together. Now the shade of green you'll get will depend on what shades of blue and yellow you have. Okay, now when there's a bit of shine on a leaf, the way I can show that is by leaving a light patch, just not putting any paint there. And now we want to get into a nice dark brown colour. Just by adding more of all the colours together, and then we'll start putting in some of this dark brown colour. And again, I'm going to leave a couple of light patches to show the shine. So just by not applying paint there and letting the white of the paper show through, that'll give me the sense of a shine. Right, so we've got those two completed, and now I'm just going to show you the finishing off of the veins very simply. So this one just needs to be filled in with a light colour. You see we've already created the space for that vein. So I'm just bringing up a light colour here, and I'll just extend that into a stalk. And that'll work for that one. And for the central vein of the primrose, I'm going to do something similar, just using a pale yellow green, running that up there. A primrose leaf can be painted in great detail, but that's not what we're after here. We're just looking for some fun techniques. There we go, just as long as it's convincing. Okay. Now, when it comes to this one, which is this leaf over here, I'm going to show you a quick and easy using a pale watercolour pencil, and we're just going to put the veins in over the top. As long as the colour of the paint was dark enough, it should show up. This is a grey pencil. I could perhaps have gone with something a little bit lighter. But you see, now it's making me look at the way the veins run, to try to get them reasonably realistic. Just drawing where I see them. Okay, so that looks like an ivy leaf. Now we have another ivy leaf here, and the central vein and the radiating veins are quite prominent. You know, if I run my fingers over, there's a ridge. Oh, that's actually more beautiful on the back. So what I'm going to do there is, with a very thin brush, I'm just going to indicate that ridge by drawing on either side of it a fine little line. Okay, and then let's have another one coming up there, and they meet up there. And let's bring that out. Of course, I could do it in exactly the same method as that one, but I just wanted to show you a different technique. And I can continue doing more of them, but it's just to show you how it's done. Now, this one here, that central vein, is a pale green. So let's do that. Right. But we do see these veins quite easily. So I'm going to use my thin brush, and I'm going to stand it on its tippy toes, and just with water draw a line. And before that dries, blot it with paper, and look, the line appears. I've lifted off the paint. And let's do the same here. Blot it, and I've lifted off the paint. And again, it's making me look at the direction in which the veins flow. And I've got to keep it very, very fine, keeping that brush standing on its tippy toes. Okay. Like that, etc. And then if we have a look at this one, it's got a sort of pale brown vein. I'm going to start this one with the stalk and just begin to run it up there. And I'm just using a very watery paint to fill that in. Okay. Now it does also have a ridge, so once it's dry, ideally I should run a little line on either side of that vein, but for now it sort of looks convincing. I'm just going to give it a little bit of dark brown on the stem while it's damp, and that will blend. And in fact, there are some blotches here and there that I could tip in. And on this one, we do see veins, and it's interesting to look at whether they come out parallel with each other or whether they're staggered. And you actually have a number of options for doing those. You could use the watercolor pencil, you could draw little ridges like that, or you could lift off. So I'm going to leave that and let you decide which way you'd like to do that. And then have a look around your garden or in a park or in a woodland and see what variety of leaves you can find and how many different interesting ways you can find to introduce colour and texture and vein patterns and even a little bit of shine. Have fun!